Recording.
Hatem, do you mind if we share on our pages, or is
Oh,
it?
absolutely, absolutely. So I'll put it.
Do you guys talk a little bit about how the event's going to go already, or?
Briefly.
1 second, just give me a second.
Hatem has some questions, so there
Okay.
shouldn't be a problem.
Is there a link, Hatem?
Just 1 second.
Take your time.
Speed.
Okay, I recognize at least 2 people of the attendees.
Hi, Sherene.
Hi, Bassam.
So welcome everyone. We're just taking a few minutes until we're sharing on Facebook and getting everybody to join us. We have about 80 people that are registered for participation. As you're waiting and visiting with us, take a look at or read the bios, which I put on the chat, and hoping to have a really a conversation about a subject that is with us, but we often ignore it, the political economy of the Middle East and North Africa. It's, as I remember James Baker said, it's about jobs. Many of our jobs here in this country are connected to the political economy of the Middle East in one way or the other. So hopefully we'll decipher some of those as we get into this conversation. So in a few minutes, we'll get going with the introduction. So just give me a few minutes. Also, if you are able to share, I'm going to put the link that you could share to your Facebook and get links in there. We already have 9 people that are on Facebook waiting for us. So welcome. I'd like to welcome both friends and colleagues. We know each other sometimes both directly, but also through the writings and the engagements through the years. I will begin with my dear friend, Professor Joel Beinin. And I didn't know that he is now emeritus and is no longer with us in the Bay Area. He's in Portland, up to the north. Professor Joel Beinin has been at Stanford for since 1983. We were talking a little bit earlier before the Bay Area became the Bay Area. As we speak today, you can't really travel any place in the Bay Area. There's traffic, and forget actually affording housing in the Bay Area. For people who are outside the Bay Area, you might afford to put the down payment for a corner in the kitchen, but nothing more than that. So really, it's a pleasure to have Joel Beinin with us. He has written and co-edited 12 books. And this is one of the books that he co-edited, and I really look forward to having the conversation. Welcome, Joel.
Thank you very much, Hatem.
You're welcome. And my dear friend, Bassam Haddad, is the director of the Middle East and Islamic Studies program and associate professor at the Schur School of Policy and Government at George Mason. I often see Bassam's work on, he's as active on the internet and on the social media and all issues pertaining to the Middle East, to Palestine, to Syria, to Lebanon, and a variety of different issues. But I also want to make a plug for Jadaliyya Easeline, so make sure that you engage with Jadaliyya. It's really an awesome source of information for those who follow the developments in the Arab world and have their pulse or have their finger to the pulse of what is taking place in the region. And for sure, last but not least, is our dear friend, Professor Sherene Seikaly, professor of history at the University of California, Santa Barbara, down south. And it's been engaged in teaching, educating, and writing, but in particular being the co-editor of Jadaliya Easline, as well as the co-editor of Journal for Palestine Studies. If you really have not accessed the Journal of Palestine Studies, it's one of the primary sources for research for many of us who engage in the work of Palestine. She has authored many works, in particular, Men of Capital, Scarcity, and Economy in Mandate Palestine. So welcome and look forward to having the conversation. So let me throw the first question, and you could go either, maybe we'll begin with Joel, but also both Bassam and Sherene. I saw that the title of the book is The Critical Political Economy of the Middle East and North Africa. And the question for me about the term critical. So what is critical in the political economy of the Middle East and North Africa in distinction to other material or other books that have political economy of the Middle East and North Africa? So let's jump on that question. What is the critical in here?
So there are, to my mind, maybe Bassam and Sherene have other ideas, because actually I think this is something that we never really discussed thoroughly. There are 2 points of reference. Critical theory usually means something to do with the Frankfurt School, which is about Western Marxism, critique of rigid materialism and the Soviet style orthodox Marxism and that sort of thing. That's very much in the background of the book, although it comes up, I mean, our approach to understanding capitalism is certainly related to the classical Marxian understandings, but we go very, very far beyond what Marx and the early Marxists wrote about. Secondly, it's more directly related to other books which are about the political economy of the Middle East. The book by John Waterbury and Alan Richards, the book by Robert Springborg and Clem Henry. These are good books in their own terms, but they miss a great deal. They don't really talk very much about the American empire. Ridiculously almost, they don't have much to say about the United States and Saudi Arabia, which is a key linchpin of the regional order today. They don't say much about the kinds of arms production and marketing and circulation that's in Shana's chapter in the book, which I think is a very important contribution. So in that sense, we tried to do something that's rather different and critical of what is now out there in the market. You're muted.
Sherene, maybe you want to jump in and.
I mean, thank you for having us. It's really nice to be here. I think Joel covered it. We actually didn't talk about the critical very much in the title of the work, but I think one of the things that makes this work different is that it actually brings together multiple different kinds of readings of political economy, different methodologies, the beginnings of a discussion on race and racialization, for example, in Miriam Davis's, Holly Davis's chapter, as Joel already mentioned, sort of the discussion of the analysis of militarization, US corporations and authoritarian regimes. I like to think that the critical in the title is really an invitation to think about political economy as a set of heterodox methodologies and approaches, and that looking at these questions of class and economic inequality from those lenses is much richer and gives us more of a chance to actually affect change.
I have little to add to this. It might as well have been a political economy of the Middle East. For me and for many of the chapter authors and my co-editors, we emphasized, at least in throughout the book, throughout most of the volume, the mutually constitutive nature of state, market, and class in a way that you don't always find in other works on political economy.
Mhm.
And at the same time, we present, at least from what I know and see, we present the realm of the economic and the political and the social, not as distinct realms, but as realms that are organic to one another, that are mutually constitutive.
Mm.
And in that sense, we escape the slide into a liberal political economy that looks at these things as distinct areas with distinct logics and distinct instruments and distinct languages, in a manner that ends up actually compromising democracy, social justice, and so on. So maybe this is one way I look at it, but this is a conversation that we can continue to have.
Well, in thinking about the periodization of study of the political economy of the Middle East of North Africa. So I know that some of the writing you begin from the Ottoman period to the post-French invasion, the British period in Egypt, then post-World War II. So for the students who are looking at or thinking about the periodization of the political economy of the Middle East, how should they approach it? How should they view it? Is it a continuum, or is there distinctiveness to each of these periods?
Well, two of us are historians, so
Yes.
we are professionally, our professional disability is to think of things as a continuum.
Yes.
And the question is, within this broad continuum, what are the points of inflection or nodal points? So of course, classically, the modern Middle East begins with Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798. This, I think, we would basically reject as a marker of modernity. There were many attempts, both in Egypt and in the broader Ottoman Empire, to do things like the things both that the French did and that Mehmed Ali did after the French invasion of Egypt. The main body of the articles are centered around the mid-19th century to the present. There are some chapters that deal with the early 19th century, but it's not the best text for that period, I would say.
I'll just add the second historical voice. I mean, I think for me personally, one of the things that I find really frustrating in political economy conversations is when people don't pay attention to the earlier periods of commercialization and commodification and how markets worked. And really, this is part of, I think, the task of this work, which is to really challenge people to take the earlier periods seriously, not as a static backdrop, but as a set of phenomenon, events, and conceptions that we have to take really seriously if we are to both engage the historical kind of trajectory and specificity, but even to do something as basic as decentering Europe or the quote unquote West as the only way that we can understand commercial relations and market economy.
I mean, I won't repeat what was said about the earlier part of the 20th century, but in some of the chapters, notably the one that I participated in writing on Tunisia, Egypt, and Syria, We basically cover the earlier period of the century, but then move to the post-independence period and look at the transformations that took place in the post-independence period in those three cases, and focus not exclusively, but focus somewhat on the role of the state in itself, for instance, being a creator of classes, not just being some sort of an outcome of a class domination. There is like a recursive relationship. And we look at those mutually considered relations again between the state, the new independent state that emerged, the classes that it molded and it was molded by, and of course, the market and the capital accumulation that took place, and how that process affected the state in its very nature, as well as the groups and social groups and classes that captured the state. To an extent where in the case of Syria and Egypt, perhaps to some extent, in the case of Syria, the groups that captured the state came from more modest rural backgrounds. And within 20 years, they became effectively the quote unquote, the upper class in Syria. The leadership of the regime became such. And in many ways, we saw this sort of positionality reflected in the policies, the relations, and the actual direction of economic change in Syria as a reflection of this. And we saw this also at the level of the state. So we covered the earlier period, but I think it was the only chapter that went farthest in beginning to address the social upheaval starting in 2010, although we did so in a timid manner and we kind of left it at that.
Maybe you could ask the question, maybe, what were your methodological approach to selecting what chapters to actually include, the arrangement, and were there thoughts about this, both thinking from what you wanted to present as well as what the audience that you're trying to address in this collection? Because I'm looking at this collection for me to deploy it for my students in their classes. And what was the thinking behind the arrangement and the structure of the selection?
You know, when you sit down to plan a book like this, and especially because there were three of us. So,
and I know how difficult it is to edit the volume, so
everybody has a wish list, right? And we should have a chapter on this, and we should have a chapter on that. And then some chapters you can very easily find people to do it, and others you can't. And some chapters people say they'll do it, but they don't. I mean, I could give now a whole critique of the book based on what's not in it, or what we didn't do as well as I think we thought we should. I mean, we definitely did not want to have, for example, a separate chapter on women. That would defeat the whole idea of gender analysis as an integral component of political economy. But with that said, very few of the chapters address that question seriously at all. A little bit in Kristen Alf's chapter. We probably should have had something about social reproduction theory, which might have addressed that more seriously. There was always the question of, should we have a chapter on Turkey and Iran? And there we didn't, mainly for questions of length, and secondarily because those are not places that the three of us are particularly expert in. So I wish I could tell you that there was a very careful,
methodological,
well-planned. I mean, there was some of that. It wasn't haphazard,
yeah.
But you know, things happen that are beyond the plan.
Anyone else on that question, or Joel covered it for you guys?
I guess I'll just say that I think one of the things that we all I think I can speak for the three of us, is that we really hope this is used in the classroom.
Mhm.
And in that sense, we meant to, cover as many bases as we could, knowing that this would just be one in a series of volumes tackling political economy from different lenses than the ones that the conventional works that we have access to, right? And so that's on one level. I mean, I don't think that any of the three of us think we gave the last word on political economy in the Middle East. It's sort of an invitation to do these kinds of things collaboratively and to continue doing them. And I think, the question of gender and sexuality is one from a political economy perspective that is really important. Questions of ability and disability is another thing that I would love to see, political economy approaches to. So it's just a beginning in that sense. And I think it's always really difficult to say, okay, this is what we include and this is what we don't. But it's just kind of here's an initial take.
And it's a conversation, it's a conversation, and conversations are not final. It also is, we also have to face some serious limitations in terms of what publishers today will publish in terms of length.
Mhm.
So let's assume that we added more content, however form, on other, say, other countries or on other topics. There would be some sort of a zero-sum game in terms of the final content. Something would have to give. Again, this is one of the volumes, or the first volume, that we, as colleagues, but also as members of the Political Economy Project, which anyone can check out, because there's actually, speaking of pedagogy, there's actually more information on the book, including an extended bibliography for every chapter at the project's website, which is the
If you could share it on the chat, will be great,
Yeah.
and we'll actually make sure
I'll
to
share
send
it.
it to people by email.
Absolutely.
One thing
I want to emphasize, Sherene very correctly said, this is the first of what we hope will be several other volumes that I hope other people will edit, not us.
well, let's say from my perspective, I was looking for such a book to use for classes. So I was so happy when I got the announcement sent to me through email. So immediately I contacted Bassam just to have a conversation, so we could actually have discussions about the book, and more importantly, really to see what type of contributions we have in this field. Let me maybe, one thing that I really enjoyed is that there is linkages that are made in the global dimension of the political economy. As you know, it's like, to use maybe Edward Said Orientalism, that the Middle East geography is over there, Middle East economy is over there, everything is outside the world. So you basically have to travel in a space shuttle to go to the Middle East conceptually. And I really enjoyed this constant presence of these linkages. In particular, the short discussion about the cotton industry in Egypt and its links to the British industry, and then you connected the connection to the enslavement institution in the New World. And I think that's just a conversation of taking the Middle East outside of this Orientalist framing and really beginning to have a larger conversation. And earlier today, there was a piece on how Great Britain, and thank God is no longer great, have actually brought impoverishment to India and completely collapsed the literacy, even though that you still see people these days speak about how colonization helped the literacy in the colonized world. So for me, that was just really a positive contribution in the book. And I don't know if that was deliberate or was it incidental, because it could be. I saw it as deliberate.
It certainly was deliberate, but we should also say that the brief discussion about cotton in the introduction, and then it's taken up again in 2 chapters that deal with Egypt, even though we have a critique of Sven Beckert's Empire of Cotton, which isn't delivered in the book, but Ahmed Shokar and Aaron Jakes have published a very long and powerful article elsewhere about this. If Sven Beckert had not written Empire of Cotton, probably we wouldn't be thinking that way. Another very influential book in my mind in connecting New World slavery is River of Black Dreams, I think that's called. And so there's been a lot of relatively new work about political economy, let's say, roughly speaking, since the 2008 financial crash. The whole conception of racialized capitalism, which really first was articulated in the 1940s and 50s and then put far on the margin of mainstream scholarship, has now become front and center. And you have some very serious scholars. Just this morning, for example, I was listening to Kianga Yamada Taylor on Democracy Now!, Amy Goodman's show. I mean, she's just one of several names who could be mentioned who are now making this absolutely indispensable way to think about what capitalism is. So we benefited from the fact that this other scholarship has been done. And I think nobody who wants to write about the Middle East and be in conversation with the broader trends of scholarship can ignore that sort of thing anymore.
I'll add, since I have the great honor of being at UCSB, where one of the thinkers of racial capitalism, Cedric Robinson, was so important to, forging and taking those categories into the Black radical tradition. I guess I would say that for me, and there is, there are a number of tensions in the work. If when you spend time with it, you can trace them. And one of the tensions is, do we talk about capitalism in Egypt, or do we talk about Egyptian capitalism? And I think this is really, at the heart of the question of the global. And I would say, in conversation with your question, Hatem, which is that it's a, I think that the conversation has shifted to not be just in response to Orientalism anymore. And I really hope that we can just move past this sort of stance where we're constantly evidencing our humanity and instead really thinking across borders, temporal as well as geographic, to position the Middle East in a global history, because of course we need Sven Beckert's book to do this critique, as Joel suggested, but also Sven Beckert needs us. That's my take anyway, which is that I think the Middle East is a global place, and right now global history is the thing to do for concrete political reasons, right? All of this is coming in a context of a political urgency globally. And I think that part of the power here is to say that you can learn a lot from the Middle East that doesn't just simply have to be a response to, right? Orientalism, or that it's only even about colonialism, right? That there are lots of overlapping structures of power that we're critiquing in the work. And I think that's really crucial to give students the tools to make sense of their everyday.
And I just want to emphasize a couple of points, starting with the fact that the Middle East is not a space against which we test theories produced elsewhere in relation to global capitalism or other processes. It itself is a generative field, arena, geographic space with very complex cases. And it inspired the production and debunking of theories and frameworks that are produced elsewhere. I mean, there are many examples. On the question of on the issue of Orientalism, I mean, without ceasing the work to combat Orientalism or Islamophobia, we actually, in addition to what Sherene said, or supporting what Sherene said, it is a really important idea, not just intellectually, but also politically, to try to go beyond that. In fact, the antecedent to the political economy project was a very substantive conference that we put together at the Arab Studies Institute and George Mason in 2011, in which Joel and Shireen were invited, and frankly, another 36 scholars. And it was titled Teaching the Middle East After the Arab Uprisings, Beyond Orientalism, Islamophobia, and Neoliberalism, so that we don't keep reducing all problems to these categories, of course, without jettisoning the importance of continuing the battle in those regards. So in many ways, this is sort of a living outcome of what we try to advocate.
You know, here an example of something that I think we should have done or could have done but didn't do that relates to this. You know, as long as Thomas Friedman is writing in the New York Times, we still have to deal with Orientalism, unfortunately, because
I don't know if you saw it, like he's on CNN every day right now. I guess, you know, he stopped peddling Orientalist, Middle Eastern, I don't want to use a term. He's now on CNN pontificating every day about how the world should be and what the United States, while he's been, you know, dog whistling on the political right for so long. So,
yeah, but the point is he's not on the right. He is in the center.
I mean, know, that's important. Dog whistles to the right.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, but he's in the center.
That's what I said. I didn't say he is.
He is there, and we have to deal with that.
Yeah.
But Sherene said there are these other structures of hierarchy and oppression. If you only think about Orientalism and Islamophobia, we're going to miss those other structures.
Sure, sure.
Just as an example, I mean, this is very different from anything that we have in the book, but some years ago, the Palestinian hip hop crew DAM did a video clip, if I could only go back in time, and it's about an honor killing, a murder of a young woman in a family because she has a relationship with a young man that the family doesn't approve of. And it's very well done. And it was criticized by American scholars as well, but this exposes things about Palestinian society that we shouldn't show in the West because we have this problem with Zionism and American imperialism. And Tamer Nafar usually doesn't speak about, he's the main guy, and he usually doesn't speak about stuff, but he answered very sharply and very appropriately. And I think I take that as a touchstone for, I mean, I'm not the one who's going to talk about what Palestinians should say. Sherene can take that on, but I think this was, he gave a very good answer for why this was an appropriate thing to do.
Maybe we could shift a little bit to the discussion about the Gulf's economy and the development that are there. There's a number of pieces in there on the Gulf, the GCC, the rentier state, and the theory of the rentier states. And maybe you could also touch on this new dynamic of the normalization that is taking place, or the Abraham Accords. And what are the political economy piece of it that now, especially for those of us who work on PDS, and how would that fit? So take us through the political economy of the Gulf, and what are we seeing? How did we get here? Centrality of oil in approaching the political economy of the Middle East and North Africa. Anyone? Bassam, I know that you want to jump
Joel, let's stick to the. I like this order where you and Sherene speak first, and I get to sort of.
You get just to comment.
Bassam mentioned that the Middle East is a place where theory has also been generated. And of course, anybody who does social science will say, well, rentier state theory, that's the contribution of the Middle East to political science and social science more broadly.
Mhm.
So the 3 chapters in the book that deal with that question all critique it and say that it is not a very helpful way of understanding things because it reifies the state and it draws attention away from the social forces that make the state and that benefit from the state, and also the broader ways in which the particular state, let's say Saudi Arabia, but we could take any of the other GCC states as well, where are they, what are the mechanisms that integrate them into the broader global economy? So all of those normal questions that you would ask about most countries, you don't get to ask them if you say, oh, well, it's just an oil rentier state. So I was very happy that there was broad agreement by the 3 main people who addressed that question in the book, that this is not a valid theoretical understanding.
I would just add that, again, one of the things that's so interesting about this volume is that you get a takedown of the rentier state theory from 3 very different perspectives. So you have Timothy Mitchell really arguing against, as he has for a long time, sort of, you know, the oil wealth, the oil curse paradigm, and really putting forward some of his, you know, insights from Carbon Democracy and other works around, you know, it's not the scarcity of oil that's the problem, it's abundance. And so, you know, he places it in that kind of sharp view, whereas Adam Henney is coming at it from a completely different kind of regional, you know, regional network sort of analysis. And that's been also his insight, you know, for a while now, really inviting us to think about Palestine in relation to the Arabian Peninsula and to think about these flows of capital moving back and forth. The third person is Nadet, right, who's writing about Iraq in a really unique way. I think that chapter should be something that is assigned on most syllabi when we talk about Iraq, because it really gives you a kind of look at how these different structures are functioning in relation to petropolitics, but also to really underlie state formation and some of the points that Bassam was talking about earlier. In terms of the recent rush to normalization in the peninsula and, you know, the role of Prince Kushner, I don't have an analysis yet. I'm you know, very excited to hear if Joel and Bassam have an analysis. I think one thing that I can say is that yesterday, or a day and a half ago, maybe 2 days, Ali Salam of Nazareth, the mayor of Nazareth, actually backed the Likud and Netanyahu. I'm sure this is stuff that all of you are following closely. It is a historic kind of move, and the first time that something like that happens in the largest sort of Palestinian city inside 1948. And so I think we're just beginning to see what the huge consequences of the Trump era and the Kushner, you know, I don't know what you want to call it, reign has been. But I feel pretty comfortable saying that I think the Trump administration has been the worst for Palestine and the Palestinians of any US presidency, which is a pretty big accomplishment given how bad most US administrations have been.
You know, I support, of course, my co-editors. And I would like to point out that one of the really positive aspects of this book is its teachability, and of course, different chapters may appeal to different types of educators and courses. But in this regard, in the terms of oil, all chapters are instructive. The one that deals, the Adam Haniya's and Nida
Mhm.
and Tim Mitchell's chapters are extremely useful especially if taken together. Tim Mitchell, just to iterate, the title of his chapter is 10 Propositions on Oil. And it's that straightforward. There are 10 propositions that address, for the most part, critical aspects that usually debunk conventional wisdom or inverts it in order to look at, for instance, the role of multinational corporations and firms and how they they didn't basically come to being to do very much besides limiting the flow of oil so that profits can be maximized. And then all of the other propositions, frankly, each of them can be like a topic to address. Same with Nida and Adam's chapters. So um, I I would actually myself, of course, and I'm teaching a course in this year on the politics of the Middle East, politics and societies of the Middle East, and I can't wait to use these texts in addition to the usual texts that we use
Mhm.
on oil, and the ones that actually debunk the rentier state. Let me just say also one thing
Mhm.
about the rentier state. I know it's very important for us to understand that, first of all, this is not new, that the rentier state theory can be and should be debunked as as a holistic theory. But that doesn't mean that every single aspect of what researchers produced in the 70s and 80s and 90s is basically erroneous. There are aspects of the rentier
Mhm.
state that that you could actually understand, rentier state's outcomes and behavior that actually still live with us, not just in the rentier economies, but also in economies like Syria and others who have X percentage of their state revenue deriving from oil, because it does give the state, especially states that have autonomy, already have political autonomy, added a cushion. So it's also important not to take this in an absolutist term, but definitely we have gone way beyond the rentier state, in my view, long ago. So we're not trying to claim that we did it.
No, I like the fact that this was dealt with, because again, you still hear the term being used in relations to the Gulf, which I think is still problematic. The other part is in terms of the Gulf economy, and it's heavy dependent on foreign labor. And in some states where the foreign labor is actually 80% of the population. And how to approach that subject, especially with all types of labor violation, labor rights violation, sexual abuse, no protection whatsoever. How do both at the same time being sensitive to not do you jump into Islamophobic type of discourse while critiquing really an important part of the Gulf economy at this point?
So this is one of the topics that it's addressed, but not really thoroughly and systematically. In part, I think because Adam Haniya, who would have been the most logical person to do that, has already written about it elsewhere.
Mm.
So let me say by way of apology, for people who don't know, this book, it comes out from Stanford University Press in a series that Laleh Khalili and I co-edit. And we have another book by Andrea Grace Wright, which was just accepted for publication, which is called Migratory Pipelines, and is exactly about migrant labor from South Asia to the Gulf. And it's quite amazing because she went to India and she learned Gujarati, and she spoke to people who actually made the trip, and she spoke to people who are the recruiters and to their families and so on, and gives a much richer idea of who these people are, because of course, if you only work in the Gulf, you can't interview them. There's no access to those people. You can only access them once they go home to South Asia or to their families who are in South Asia while they are in the Gulf. So it's going to take a while for that book to come out because it was just approved for publication. But I would point people to that. I want to come back, if I may, though, to the question that you asked and we didn't answer. And that's about the Abraham Accords. And Sherene kind of gave a nod to it, but also we should say more about it. There's nothing about this in the book, or not even anything about a hint that this was underway.
Well, Kushner did not share his chapter with you guys.
Indeed, indeed. Looking back on it, though, we could understand it differently. In 2005, Rebecca Stein and I published the first volume in this series that Laleh Khalili and I are now co-editing, called The Struggle for Sovereignty, Israel and Palestine. And the moment was when Israel pulled out of the Gaza Strip, sort of, but not really. And the thinking of Ariel Sharon behind that was, we will abandon the Gaza Strip to its fate, whatever that will be, we really don't care, and we're going to annex the West Bank. And in a certain way, that's a version of what Kushner came up with. So looking back at the last decade and a half, I think what we see is that the contours of the question of Palestine have become transformed so that they are unrecognizable in terms of the discourse that predominated before. Until, let's say, about 2005, the international consensus was two-state solution. Many people were not all that serious about it, including the government of Israel, but that's what everybody said. And then you would have this minority of people say, no, that's actually not all that just. One person, one vote, that's more just, so forth. Those options are not what's on the table now. I mean, one or the other of them may in the very distant future come about, I don't know. But what we are now confronting is a situation of one regime between the river and the sea, in which the majority of the population is not Jewish, and it's colonial apartheid. And the terms of the struggle are necessarily, therefore, very different. 10, 15 years ago, nobody talked about the Palestinian Arab citizens of Israel as an integral component of the Palestinian people whose fate is integrally linked to what happens to refugees and people under occupation in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Now they are, in fact, the most dynamic element among the Palestinian people. You can't understand Palestinian politics if you don't bring them into the mix. So on the one hand, the Gulf countries moving away from direct concern about Palestine, the Israeli high-tech surveillance companies like NSO, on one hand, heavily people who were in the Israeli military intelligence digital unit, they are working hand in glove with the Gulf countries. They may even have been involved with the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi. So we are seeing the emergence of a rather new set of realities that, in particular, with regard to how we think about Palestine, require us to think differently, but also the broad shape of the region is changing because Israel is now becoming fully integrated into it.
And we didn't touch on, Sherene, maybe you wanted to say, go ahead, jump in, and
I'm
then
sorry, I'll just be
Go ahead.
very quick.
No, you don't have to, by all means.
I want to also, I'm super grateful about the way you phrased that question, because I think the two things are linked. And so the question of migrant labor in the peninsula and the question of moving beyond sort of not falling into Islamophobia, but moving beyond sort of those questions. And I think that's linked actually to the Palestine question in really easy ways, which is that the time has come for scholars of the Middle East and scholars of the Arabian Peninsula and the Middle East and North Africa to really face and challenge the racialized logics that inform the structures of our social landscapes. We cannot continue to say that race and racialization do not happen in the Middle East and North Africa, and these are simply imports from the West and they don't make sense here, right? We have actually existing forms of enslavement happening in the Arabian Peninsula, happening in places like Lebanon, okay? And, Hatem has done a lot of this work, and all of the sources that Joel mentioned, but this is something that is urgent for us to now move on and put our energy behind. And I think it's connected to the Palestine question because why? Because, so many of the states in the Middle East and North Africa have since 1948 given a lot of lip service to the question of Palestine, used the question of Palestine to contain their own popular dissent at the same time that they've conducted different forms of normalization. And now everything is out in the open and a huge taboo has been broken. And the kind of celebrations we saw between the UAE, I'm sure everybody was on all those crazy memes like I was. And that cultural shift is very significant. And I haven't been able to wrap my mind around it yet. But I do think that a thoroughgoing critique of people who hold power and maintain hegemony over wealth and material dominance are people we must critique vigilantly and not be afraid of, but that's what, Islamophobes say. So what? Like, do we have to constantly worry about what the Islamophobes are going to, they're going to hate us anyway. We're not going to convince those people. All we have to do is figure out how we can make our lives better, our societies better, right? And we can't do that without asking the hard questions. And again, I think this volume is the beginning of asking those questions.
Again, in the work on Islamophobia, taking a decolonial approach to it, you have to do a double critique constantly, meaning that you have to challenge the Islamophobes, but also you have to challenge this, attempt to almost do an erasure of the specificity of the Muslim Arab experience. So, for example, many people say, well, Islam, we don't have racism. Well, Islam might have an epistemic of anti-racist discourse, but Muslims have drank the Kool-Aid of racism for a long period of time. And what we need is to do that critique in a systematic way, especially as we're seeing the obscenity of neoliberal economic models, the type of, I don't use the term development because it's an insult to the term, to actually, it's almost underdevelopment, complete destruction of the concept of development that we are witnessing. Bassam,
I'll just say really quickly, one thing that has driven me crazy this last week around like everybody talking about, the Capitol on Wednesday, sort of just to follow on your, sort of thinking out loud about Islamophobia, and sometimes people who are our friends and allies, right, who are saying, oh, DC looked like Baghdad. And it's like, Baghdad looks like Baghdad because of DC. So, can we try and actually move beyond this East-West binary that has completely confined our imaginations in ways that we can't think about politics beyond it, across it, to challenge those, because right now, everybody is suffering in different ways to different degrees, right? So it's an opportunity, as difficult as this time is, to really begin to think differently.
I mean, the politics of knowledge production that Joel and Sherene, specifically what Sherene just said the last 2 minutes, is critically important, and not just for, again, not just for intellectual purposes, but also for strictly political purposes. And at the level of analysis and frameworks, I'll just be satisfied with saying the following. When we talk about race and gender, we're also talking about things that are always part and parcel of the capitalist sort of edifice, or the edifice of capitalism, and how capital accumulation proceeds, and it engulfs all these categories within it in such a way that we cannot simply talk about, a critical political economy, and then class, and then gender, and then race. I mean, this is precisely what, in my view, liberal politics is about: the differentiation of things that are inherently connected and organic. And that could very well be not just a topic for a next volume that we might work on, but it could very well be one of the sources of insurrection in parts of the Arab world, maybe beyond, that have hitherto been able to weather the storm. The question, especially of migrant labor and things related to this topic. I mean, this is something that is a cauldron, and it might, just like the uprising surprised many of us, it might surprise us in the future.
But just to carry on, if you actually recall, just in the most recent few weeks, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates are pressuring Pakistan to enter into the Abrahamic Accords for normalization, and the threat is the migrant labor force, Pakistani migrant labor force in the Gulf. So now you're not only having labor force that's their only source of income and the remittances to their families in some of the desperate locations in Pakistan, but now they're being made as a bargaining chip of possibly being replaced if Pakistan would not enter into this normalization pattern. So this is a new type of political landscape that we're dealing with, political economy being really utilized in this particular juncture to the Abrahamic Accords. I don't know if you followed that case and the pressure that was mounted on Imran Khan in Pakistan.
So I think one way to think about this, I mean, this is very far beyond the scope of the volume, and deserves a serious treatment that will be based on a lot more depth of thought than what my response to your
and
raising.
if I may add, it's the same type of pressure that was applied to Yasser Arafat early on, because Palestinians were working in the Gulf. So if he does not accept certain conditions of the Arab world, that the Palestinians will be let go from their jobs.
But I think now we're in a different mode now. I think what we are seeing is that Saudi Arabia, but really it's the Emirates behind the Saudis who have the political vision. They're making a play to be major players in global capitalism. Mm-hmm. And they're thinking, we have a lot of money, so we should be able to have some leverage. And to understand how this may work out in broad terms, it's worth it to think about Japan in the 1980s. In the 1980s, many people were thinking, that's it for the United States. Japan is going to overtake the United States. Their economy is booming, growing 10% per year, and they make everything and they design everything so much better. Japanese vehicles so much better than American cars. And what happened? It blew up in smoke, and the Japanese economy has been stagnant for the better part of 3-4 decades now. I think we are still, unfortunately, still in a moment when it's only the United States who can lead the capitalist world. Only the United States has all of the institutions that integrate the financial transactions and the global flows of capital and so on. The Saudis and the Emiratis will fail if they seriously try to challenge that. So Kushner and Trump, they are breakers. They didn't understand that there is a structure to global capitalism, and in order to keep it stable, people have to remain more or less in their lanes. And yeah, you can negotiate about this or that, but you don't upset the apple cart. They were willing to upset the apple cart. It's why Trump has the kind of following that he does. But in the long run, first of all, Biden is going to pull back from all of that. He was going to try to put everything back in the box. He may not be able to succeed in doing that, but he will certainly try. And in the end of the day, the Saudis and the GCC countries more broadly simply don't have the institutional capacity to play the kind of role that Trump and Kushner have been encouraging them to play. Especially because in the coming decades, fossil fuels are going to be less important, and there's already a glut of fossil fuels on the global market. So if we speculate, and I acknowledge this is a speculation, if we speculate grandly, the big hubbub about the Abraham Accords, that's important in a certain scale of thinking about the issue, but I'm not sure that it's going to be important in the long run.
Maybe we're coming to the later part of the hour, so maybe I just have a question. What I liked is in the writing is that to treat the Middle East as each country not all having similarity or the same, but they're actually each is unique in a sense. And in thinking about the Arab Spring, which is right now it's almost a long history, maybe we could talk a little bit about how can we analyze the Arab Spring, and maybe looking forward, do we see other breaking points coming in the near future? And again, this is just not your crystal ball, but in general, thinking about the economic factors behind the Arab Spring, and to think about what are things that might emerge in different areas, whether it's in Egypt, Morocco, or I know that's not your field of areas, but is there something else that we might see in the near future based on the Arab Spring?
Okay, I'm going to take this first so that I can then just sit and watch Joel and Bassam struggle with this question. I mean, this is a conversation we're all having all the time. And again, for me, as a historian, I really push back against seeing the Arab uprisings as a rupture. I think for all of us who teach history of the Middle East, especially if we teach it as a social history, that really is looking at, class and social status and social oppression and gender and sexuality and so on, really you could teach the history of the Middle East through uprisings. Uprisings and upheavals and demonstrations, beginning with the tobacco revolt in Persia, to the Arabi revolt in Egypt, to on and on and on and on, right? I mean, I always teach Joel's book on social movements and is it peasants and
Workers and peasants.
Yeah, workers and peasants. And, it's so important to tell students, like literally every year, there is something happening in the Middle East. And one of the things that happened to me because we're, in Zoom university land, was that I had to go back to all my Middle East lectures and update them completely. And so I decided, okay, I have this really outdated lecture on the Iranian Revolution. And the lecture is basically like, Reza Shah bad, Mossadegh good, short period, CIA bad, M16 bad, Khomeini bad, but not as bad as you think he is because you're Islamophobic. And I came to the realization that, people who are taking my classes now don't even know who Khomeini is. They don't, it's not in there.
Well, if it's not in TikTok, you don't know it these days.
They don't even, they're like, who? And so I decided, let me educate myself and go back to some of the kind of early work that Abrahamian did in Marab, right? Where he was, and I got this, Shiva, I was like reaching out to my friends, like Shiva Baladi, and she was like, okay, use this, use that. And if you look really closely, every year there's something happening, right? From the early 1950s up and way after 79. Yeah. And so I would just urge us to really move beyond seeing the Arab uprisings as this huge rupture. I had the great fortune of being in Egypt when the Egyptian Revolution happened, and it was a rupture for me in my life in the best of ways until it became a nightmare. So I'm not trying to say that it's not significant, but I think we need to really kind of think about the longue durée, because I think we're in it for the long haul. And I think we're facing an incredible resurgence of right-wing xenophobia, misogyny, you name it, racism, hatred. And I think, the return to Biden's hopeful inauguration next week will be a kind of return to polite imperialism, but we kind of need that politeness, because having somebody who's just sort of egging on Sisi and, Bibi and Modi and all these guys, it's, I think, a chance for us to breathe. It's a chance for us to breathe and recalibrate and take stock of what's happening right now. And I think in answer to your question, uprisings are always going to happen. They're never stopping, I mean, we've paid so much attention to Lebanon and much less attention to Sudan, which frankly was a fascinating experiment in social upheaval and organizing and spontaneity across different kinds of, affiliations. So
and
I'm hopeful that we will continue to see that sort of resistance.
And we just had one in Washington, by the way, a small uprising. I just, I want to do two things. I want to say that it also depends on the audience. So what Sherene is addressing in terms of the importance of recognizing that this is not something that is entirely new, or that is not something that is entirely different from various historical junctures, is also intended, in my view at least, for those people who assume that the Arab uprisings represent an awakening, as though everything, or as though nothing happened before, and then there's this rupture. In that sense, I agree with what Sherene said. However, I must say that one of, and I teach a course on the Arab uprisings, and I have been for the past several years. And we actually now have a major project on the Arab uprisings with about 15 partners worldwide, starting actually next Thursday. So it's really important, and I'm not going to say very much. I'm just going to say that it's really important to not consider the term Arab uprisings to refer to the unit of analysis that is the Arab uprisings. The Arab uprisings are not the unit of analysis. There are several countries or several polities that experienced mass protests in many different ways. What happened in Tunis is very different than what happened elsewhere. Syria, I mean, many Syrians would listen to discussions of the uprising not being a rupture, and they would differ because of the depth of what happened in Syria compared to, I don't know, maybe Tunisia, maybe less so, of course, Libya, Yemen, and so on. But it's really important to recognize that there are several units of analysis that have to do with the particular locale in which mass protests and the rest of it took place. I think that's the most important point, because we speak of uprisings sometimes as though this is the unit of analysis. It's not. And second, it's really crucial, in my view, for us to recognize that the different countries that actually experienced tremors but didn't lead up to uprisings are as important to study. Why did the tremors in Saudi Arabia not lead to very much? Same thing with Morocco. If you follow the Moroccan experience with the February 22 date being so crucial to what happened in
Or
Morocco,
Jordan.
or Jordan,
So why the monarchies
even
were
Algeria in the first iteration before
yeah.
we had the actual. So I just would like to reiterate
Or Bahrain as well.
the importance of looking at the different cases. And in terms of the future, like you said, I mean, I am in political science, but I'm known, or at least I'd like to profess that I am a self-hating political scientist. So I am not very, even political scientists are not in the business of predicting. That's policy and so on. But it's very difficult to understand the future or even the uprisings without understanding certain things, even if they are not what we should reduce the uprisings to. But the economic change that took place, the social and economic change that started taking place in the Arab world, at least the countries that experienced these protests,
Maybe I could
in the 1980s is really an important starting point.
maybe I
It's
could
not the
frame
end of
it. Maybe I could frame the question differently rather than predicting. Is that we're having a Biden administration, and just 2 days ago or yesterday, Pompeo have begun to put Yemen, the Houthi, within the countries or organizations that sponsor terrorism. There's a move to try to put certain pieces in there in the Trump for the last few days of Trump's administration pertaining to the Middle East. So maybe we could look at what are the changes that we're looking at from the Biden administration versus Trump, and how maybe the Arab world is responding. And do we see places where the tension possibly will escalate versus areas where the tension is not? And particular for us in relations to Palestine, because we're going to now get the new introduction to another Secretary of State, because we tend to be cursed to know all the secretaries of state of the United States from 1917 to now. So we're going to have to learn a new name and a whole host of peculiar type of personalities in there. So maybe we could frame it in that way rather than only the Arab Spring and what might ruptures or things that we could see in the future.
So I would suggest that in the same way that Sherene and in a different mode Bassam have argued that the uprisings aren't the unit of analysis and that we have to look at the longue durée, the shift between Trump and Biden is also not a unit of analysis. American policy, specifically on Palestine, but more broadly on the Middle East, has been pretty consistent. There have been a few outlying moments. Eisenhower told the Israelis they had to get out of the Gaza Strip and Sinai in 1956. James Baker made a particularly bold speech at an AIPAC conference one year. But by and large, there's been pretty broad consistency, at least since the mid to late 1960s. So parallel to that, let's say, since the crisis of the global mode of capitalist accumulation that was set in place with Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, Fordism, Keynesianism, or the glorious 30 years, as the French call it. So early to mid 1970s. World War II to that is one period. So since the mid 1970s, while all the administrations have dealt high-handedly with Palestine, to put it mildly, the Middle East, along with other important parts of the world have been going through a crisis of capital accumulation because while neoliberalism appeared to have resolved the problem in the global north, it exacerbated the problems in the global south. So let's pick some moments. The 1977 bread intifada in Egypt, which was one of the very first uprisings against the effort to impose global neoliberalism, a direct response to what the IMF tried to do in Egypt by removing subsidies. We could then go to the whole wave of strikes that happened in Egypt in the mid 1980s, a continuation of that. We'll skip a few years and go to 1998 to the deposition of Mubarak when there were over 2,400 strikes and hundreds of thousands of Egyptian workers involved in various collective actions. In Tunisia, 2008, you had a 6-month-long uprising of phosphate mine workers. In Bahrain, you've had many uprisings throughout this whole period, which are not sectarian Shia against a Sunni ruling class, although there is a Sunni ruling class. And then, of course, in Tunisia, even though people said, oh, well, Tunisia's the exception, that had transition to democracy, but in all the rural areas of the places like Sidi Bouzid, where the uprising began in December of 2010, there have been many uprisings of 3-4 days, 2 weeks from 2012 until very recently. And then, of course, Algeria, Sudan, Iraq, Lebanon. So what we have here is a continuous process of resistance to efforts to impose neoliberalism. Now, the Abraham Accords and the Emirati-Saudi program is to mobilize neoliberalism and defeat Iran. And that's the axis of realignment that they are working on. And I suggested that I'm not sure that they can succeed in doing that. But if we think about the problem in those terms, the question of whether any particular uprising achieved its immediate goal is much less important because every uprising builds on the one that came before it. So whenever this cycle of protest culminates, and we can't, of course, predict that at all, looking back on it, you're going to be able to see this whole accumulation of social movements and protests and mobilizations.
There's few questions, but I think we addressed most of them. The last question I want to ask, which touches maybe to speak about the relationship between the Arab, Middle Eastern diaspora and their particular countries. The question is about political economy of Lebanon, but we could speak about Palestinian diaspora, Egyptian diaspora, Tunisian, Algerians, especially if you think about Europe and its dependency on labor of North Africa, the relationship, and you could conclude with that in relations to the political economy of the Middle East. Diaspora, released from migration, and the relationship with the political economy of the particular countries.
Unfortunately, it's not a topic we included in the book. People should read things like Paul Silverstein's Algeria and France, and there are actually many other good books about topics like this. It's a very important topic that it's just, it was too much for us to include in the book.
I would say, if I could, that the question, I mean, as Joel said, we don't really address this in the volume, but Ziad Abu Rish's piece does sort of put it in that put some context of, the kinds of remittances that we're talking about with the huge Lebanese diaspora. Also, this is a much earlier story with the Mahjad, right? And the go-to person, I think, there is Ilham Khoury Maqdisi, also Stacey Farenthold's new book, which really tackles some of this during World War I. As you can see, my interests are a little bit earlier, but of course there's plenty of, there's an entire field of Arab American studies now, right? That has been pretty strong long before 9/11 and then got kind of overshadowed after 9/11, but people have been doing that work for a long time. So I think the Lebanese diaspora is the one that we know the most about. I'm thinking here specifically of Akram Fuad Khater's work and how he has taught us about the ways that these returning migrants kind of infused capital into Lebanon and what that meant for the social landscape. It's also very much a story for early 20th century Palestine. So that, these are all questions that I think invite more volumes and more research. And I think that's the most exciting thing about any book when actually people can pick it up and say, what about this? And find new areas of study.
And also I could mention the post-Oslo Palestinians returning, especially from the United States, and beginning to build almost mini mansions all over the West Bank under the premise that this is the state to be, but the relationship between the diaspora and being really recruited into this whole neoliberal economic modality for the occupied territories.
In a tragic empiric example today, the gravity of the question of migration and remittances is on full display in Lebanon, a country where the migrant community, the diaspora, actually numbers much more, not just more than double even the population of Lebanon, which is part and parcel of the sort of camouflaging of crises because of the remittances that were arriving in Lebanon. But what's on tragic display now, and precisely because that had been the case, given the inability of people in Lebanon to actually withdraw dollars or receive funds even from the outside in the same way that they did before, we are seeing the crisis in Lebanon today worse than any other time in the past several decades, even during the civil war. And it's precisely because that sort of Sammam al-Aman, the safety valve, or the sort of exit, right, is no longer as available, exit in an inverted form. And so in a way, this topic, if you add to the question of Lebanon and Palestine, the issue of displacement in Syria, where more than 51 or 52% of the population was displaced internally and externally, with about 6 million displaced externally. I mean, we're talking about questions of migration, refugees, and similar topics that merit now more than ever much more of a serious study, beyond the idea of having somebody who is interested in these topics. I mean, this has become a central topic. And then on the question of, I think it was Srimati Mitter, in terms of, the book in relation to other books. I mean, I grew up reading Riches and Waterbury, and then, of course, taught it as an available book. Unfortunately, after the first edition, they dropped class from their framework, which was a very odd development. In all cases, this book, I mean, one of the answers, an answer at least, is that this book is also a product of these times of intersectionality, of diversity, of eclecticism. So the person here, he or she mentions, or they mention different names that we actually address. Joel addresses in his introduction, but most of these volumes had a particular methodological approach. In this volume, it's far more eclectic. It actually is also eclectic in terms of the disciplines of the authors. So in my view, it is the shape of things to come in many ways, and it's actually a remarkable teaching tool because it expands our disciplinary boundaries and imagination. I've learned so much from being part of this effort because I read material on political economy from perspectives that were very interesting and that also stretched my more social sciencey approach to things. So these are the ways in which this book is distinguished, for better or for worse.
Joel, do you have anything to add on this question?
Well, as Bassam said, I said my word on the Richards and Waterbury, and now Melanie Kamet and Ishaq on book, and also on the Bob Springborg and Clem Henry's book. There are probably some other books that we might have discussed, but mostly for reasons of space, didn't. I think Bassam is right that a book like Richards and Waterbury, especially in its first 2 or 3 editions, is a product of a particular moment of neoliberal triumphalism.
They move from class to social
I
actors.
mean, that's why class disappeared. Yeah. It wasn't an odd choice. It was a very specific thing that happened. Especially, I mean, I know Ellen Richards very well. We were roommates on Casa in Cairo in 1969, for God's sake. He was a radical. He was actually far to my left at that point in our lives. So without putting too much onto him as an individual, I think his career trajectory is an expression of a certain political transformation linked to an intellectual transformation that happened very broadly in American social science. That moment is over now. And that's why our book has an eclectic approach. We are not ready, and I don't think we ever should be ready to say, oh, this is the correct line. This is the right way to understand this problem. No, we should have serious debate about all these things, hopefully politely, because very important things are at stake. But no, we're in a very fluid moment historically, and that means that scholarship too has to be somewhat humble in terms of what we think we can understand. I mean, not to hide, that's not a reason to not say what you think, but also to not imagine that that's the final word in any way.
Well, it's definitely not the final word on the academic production and scholarship, but it'll be the final word for our conversation today. Thank you, Joel. Thank you, Bassam. Thank you, Sherene. You enriched the conversation. I encourage everyone to pick the book, Critical Political Economy of Middle East and North Africa. Also, make sure to access the website for bibliography. And so you can't say, well, what other materials I should read? Take a look at the bibliography. Again, many of us as faculty, that's the question you get. So you have a fully developed bibliography there, so they make your work easy in this sense. And hopefully that this volume will lead to other volumes. So we'll have a conversation about the political economy of the Middle East as well as others. For those who continue to watch what is taking place in Palestine, please constantly engage and look at the new materials that will be coming out relative to the various mobilization, especially as we get into the new semester on the campus. There'll be many events and many activities taking place. So thank you for being with us. And this recording will be loaded to YouTube, and we'll send an email to everyone to access it.
Thank you, Hatem.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Salam.
Basalam.
Salam.